All right, ladies and gentlemen. So for today's presentation, we're going to look at another one of our body systems. This time we're going to look at the excretory system. Now, the excretory system has two main purposes. The first is to remove chemical waste from your blood. One of the things you have to understand is that all of these metabolic reactions that go on inside your body actually produce a lot of waste. Sometimes that waste is carbon dioxide. We'll talk about that in a later presentation. Then you have to exhale to get rid of that. But one of the chemical wastes that gets off is something called urea, which is a waste product that contains nitrogen. Your body, because you're a land organism, actually takes that nitrogen waste that's an amine and turns it into urea, which it then stores in your, filters out in your kidneys, stores in your bladder until you can get rid of it. Other organisms actually use different versions of that, like some use uric acid. It depends on the type of environment the organism lives in. But at the end of the day, every living organism has to get rid of that nitrogen waste, and that waste comes from metabolic reactions. And you have an entire system dedicated to that, and that's the excretory system. Now, the other thing the excretory system does, which is really important, it maintains fluid balance in your blood, which is sort of a fancy way of saying it helps maintain your blood pressure. See, the thing is, you need a certain amount of pressure in your blood for the beating of your heart to get it through all of the arteries and veins in your body and back to the heart. And if that pressure ever dips too low, the blood can't complete the travel. And then, that obviously can lead to death. And so it's very important that your kidneys and your large intestine does this as well, but they work together to make sure that you have enough fluid in the parts of your body that require fluid. All right? So those are the main purposes of the excretory system. So the excretory system is a little more simplistic than the digestive system was. There's not as many organs involved, but you have the basics. So over here, you have the kidney, and you notice that there's actually two kidneys, all right? It's one of those body systems that's duplicated. Part of that is for redundancy, so that way if you ever have damage to one kidney, the other one can actually still do most of the job. It just wears it out quicker. The other thing is because, you have a lot of volume of blood, and so splitting that into two kidneys actually makes it a more efficient process. All right. You have the ureters, which are right here and here. And they're mostly just the tubes that connect the kidneys to the bladder. So when the kidneys are done with the job of filtering, they basically just take that stuff, which is now urine, and dump it in the bladder. Down here you have the bladder. Okay. And the bladder is just a storage sac. It's a flexible storage sac, like a balloon. And again, just like it was with your anus, being able to contain your waste so that you can relieve yourself of it at a convenient time, the bladder is sort of the same way. It's a flexible sac that as it fills with urine, it expands, and eventually it expands to the point where it can't expand anymore, and that starts sending signals to your brain that you need to empty it. Again, by allowing you to not do it at every moment of the day, it creates a more convenient situation. You don't have urine running down your leg all day long. The last point here is the urethra, all right? And the urethra is the exit from the bladder, and you actually have a pretty strong muscle at the top of the urethra that prevents leakage out of the bladder. And the urethra, is just a fancy term for the tissue that is the exit from your bladder. All right, that's really what that is. The only interesting thing about the urethra is it's different lengths in males and females, due to their sexual organs. The only thing that's interesting about that is, not that it's not interesting, but the real thing that comes up a lot is if you ever have kidney stones, where that urea actually collects as a solid instead of a liquid, which is a very, very painful thing. It's a little harder for a male to pass a kidney stone just because the urethra is longer. And I think that females are probably a little bit more prone to getting infections inside their bladder or their urethra because theirs is a little shorter. But other than that, there's not really a functional difference there. That has to do with the other aspects of the genitalia. Now, the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to the digestive system is what's known as the nephron. So this entire diagram here is a nephron. That sounds confusing because it looks like I have a diagram with a whole lot of things in it. But the nephron is what we refer to as the functional unit of the kidneys. Now, if you recall, structure equals function. So these structures that you see right in front of you on this diagram are what allows the kidney to maintain water balance and filter waste from the blood. Now, in each one of these kidneys on this diagram, there are 0.8 to 1.5 million nephrons. Depends on the size of the individual and the size of their kidneys. So this structure you see in front of you is actually really small and repeated in excessive amounts inside each kidney. And what happens is, as your blood, because all of the blood in your body passes through your kidneys, as your blood passes through the kidneys, it gets funneled to each of these nephrons, and each nephron filters a small amount of the blood and dumps the waste into the ureters, which go to the bladder, and it takes the blood and the stuff that it wants to keep in it and pushes that back to the veins so it gets recirculated. So a couple things here. You have this structure, which is right here. All right, it looks like a big brain, a little tiny brain almost. It's actually just sort of like collected blood vessels, and that's called the glomerulus. Now the glomerulus is the site of what we call pressure filtration. What happens is all the blood from your body gets pushed into the glomerulus. And as it gets pushed into the glomerulus, there's just a ton, the way the glomerulus is set up with all those blood vessels sort of twisted around each other, there's just a ton of pressure. It's almost like, I don't know, squeezing a sponge. And all that water just seeps out of the sponge. So all the liquid and stuff and a lot of chemicals inside the blood seep out. And they end up in this tube that surrounds the glomerulus, and that's called the proximal convoluted tubule. The name isn't really important. I just want you to have a basic sense of how this works, all right? And the part of the tubule that surrounds the glomerulus right here is actually known as Bowman's capsule. Apparently that's the big thing in science. You discover how something works, you get it named after you. So, all that blood gets squeezed out, it gets pushed into the Bowman's capsule, and then it dumps into this tube. And if you follow the tube, I'm going to switch colors here. If you follow the tube, right? It goes up and then around and then down and then it goes back up and it ends up in this thing we call the collecting duct. And you'll notice down here I have this note that the collecting duct ends up in the ureter, which dumps stuff in the bladder. So the question is, why does it go through this big loop, which you'll notice is called the loop of Henle? And the reason it goes through that loop is it gives the solution that ends up in that tube time. And the reason it needs time is because it needs to take back the things it wants. So if it needs some water based upon what was pushed in there, it takes back the water. If it needs some salt based upon what was pushed in there, it takes back the salt. If it needs enzymes that were pushed in there that shouldn't be, takes them back. It needs time. That's why it goes all the way down and all the way up. And you can see in here all of these blood vessels that I'm highlighting in green that are just everywhere, all around it. And those blood vessels are what allows it to sort of take the things it needs back. And that's really what the kidney does. You push all this stuff out. You're pushing stuff out you want to keep, but you're guaranteeing that you push out things you want rid of. And then you make that stuff that's a combination of stuff you wanted to keep and stuff you wanted to get rid of, and you push it through this loop of Henle. And since the loop of Henle is so long, there is time for your blood vessels to pull back all the things they never wanted to get rid of. And then by the time the filtrate ends up through the loop of Henle and into the collecting duct, hopefully, if your kidneys are functioning properly, they have collected back everything that they didn't want to lose. And then what they did want to get rid of ends up in the bladder. What they wanted to keep ends up back in your bloodstream. It's not the most efficient. I mean, it's actually really brilliant, to tell you the truth. But it's not the most efficient, but what it is it is the best situation that could have evolved from organisms that existed previous to us or previous to kidneys. And it's actually a pretty cool, simplistic thing. All right, so that's the excretory system and the nephron of the kidney.